Gainesville, a peaceful college town in Florida, was once swallowed by darkness when a brutal killing spree shook the entire nation. Victims were decapitated, crime scenes staged like twisted rituals, and a killer who vanished like a ghost. But amidst the fear, one woman survived, and from that moment, the nightmare began to unravel. This isn't just a crime story. It's a chase, a battle for justice, and a war between light and shadow. If you're drawn to gripping true crime stories, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you won't miss any of our upcoming exclusive videos. Wahenam unenrus to Nawarter, Gainesville John Hong Kon Nang Hudio Jot, Nhong Jiu Jo Hong Lam Diu Botsu, How Hook, Gui Hang Hin Sin, Vien Motu, Hapnoak Mai Jovim. Jai Hawk Florida la, Trai Timqua, Tenfo, Mod Noi Toitri, Ron Rang Vajai Apn Hung Khat Vong. Katski Tuk Sha, Kan Husin Vien Kin Fong, Quan Ka Pemo Kwa Suo Jem, Nhong Joy Mat Sang Goi Hi Vong, Hue Hen Mo Tong Lai Trending Up Work Mo. Trin Hong Kon Po Rop Bong Kai, Nhong Chek, Shitai Chojo Jak Lan Ban Chamrai, Kem Teo Tien Kwa Noi Kong Tengot. Ai Kong Ban Ron Voi Lich Hog, Lich Tiech Van Hang Boi Shup en Jiao Tien Kong Ban Be Moi. Nhong Trong Ki Ho Mo Ran Hang Chong Joy Toi Sang, Ti Jiao Jo, Mod Bong Toi Jang Len Loi, Wu Hin Kien Han Va Jai Ats I. Kong Ai Shu I Jen Kila Matlang, Tangan Kurung, Sao Trong, Hei Chiek Se Kuki Thuong, Jokwa Jem Gan Ku. Chung Ku Sin Vien. Kong Ai Je Tam Jen An Matlang, Le Doi Teo Tu, Sao Hung Tam, Rembui Bam. Moin Goi Kon Kwa, Ban Voi Kwok Song Moi. Vuaniem Tin Rang, Gainesville La Tham Fo Anton, Tan Tien Va Jang Song. Nhong Ki An Huang, Hon Hom Jo Bao Troi, Motso Kan Kwa Kong Chon Mo, Ravao Sang Hom So. Bonbe Ba Jiao Nhan Tin Hoin Hao, Nhong Kong Han Jo Koi Jap. Nhong Chik Jien To Ai Rio Kong Kong Guai Bat Mai. Mot Ngai, Roi Hang Gai Troi Kwa, Noilo Ding Dan Trong Long Nguai Than, Hung Kong, Ainang Gorang. Jiu Jang Jen Lai Lei Hoi Dao Kwa Mo Choi, Ak Mong Keo Dai. Ngai Jo Tien Kuenam Hok, Kong La Lux Gainesville Bat Jiao, Chim Bao Bao Kong, Kibaten. Mot Vai Sin Viem Bo Hok, Vike Jot Ngat. Katski Tukcha, Bat Jiao Jong Kue Samhon. Ngoi Tashi Jiao Nhang Tin Jong Kila. Now La Matik, Now La E Jobi Theodoi. Tatka Van Kon Mohor, Hong Kailan Len Loi Trongyo He Florida, Hom I Kong Fedu Thoitiet. Mot Kon Ak Mong Jun Jen Voi Gainesville. Vano Kong Jen Bang Ting Het. No Jen Trongim Lang, Hin Hung Dao Vid Jiao Tien Van Kon Bisha Huat Sao Lo Bin Yang Yatao. Early Tuesday morning, police received a frantic call from a tenant in a newly built apartment complex. A foul odor had begun seeping from the last unit at the end of the hallway. When officers forced the door open, even the most seasoned among them were left speechless. Inside lay the lifeless bodies of two female students, Sonia and Christina, sprawled grotesquely in the living room. Not a trace of struggle, no cries for help. Death had entered quietly, and what it left behind was a scene as horrifying as it was deliberate. One of the victims had been propped up against the wall, hands neatly folded on her lap, her eyes wide open, seemingly forced to witness her own end. The apartment, disturbingly tidy, betrayed almost no signs of chaos. In the bedroom, streaks of dried blood painted trails from the bed to the floor. A military-style combat knife, oddly clean, was found resting in the kitchen sink. The killer had taken his time. There was no panic, no rush, only eerie precision and terrifying calm. Drops of water still fell from the bathroom faucet. A blood-stained T-shirt, neatly folded, sat atop the toilet lid. Nothing had been stolen. No locks were broken. It was as if the killer had entered and exited without resistance, like a shadow that belonged there. What chilled investigators the most wasn't just the brutality, but the theatrical arrangement of the bodies. This wasn't an outburst. It was a statement, calculated, methodical, and deeply disturbed. By morning, a special task force was assembled. Criminal profilers, forensic teams, and local detectives worked side by side. The staging of the scene was too intentional. This wasn't a random killer. It was someone sending a message. He was here, and he was not done. The student dorms turned silent. Many tenants packed their bags in haste. Emergency campus meetings were held behind closed doors. The news began reporting on the murders, but the most graphic details were withheld. Police knew the killer might be watching, analyzing their every move. Meanwhile, Gainesville slipped into a quiet panic. No one wanted to be alone. Residents rushed to buy guns, secured their homes, and taped newspaper over their windows. But to the predator hiding among them, these were not deterrents. They were invitations. Less than 24 hours after the discovery of Sonia and Christina's bodies, Gainesville was shaken once more. A third victim had been found, this time in another student apartment not far from the university dorms. Police were alerted by a classmate who hadn't heard from her in over a day. Her name was Krista Hoy, a sophomore known for her gentle demeanor and quiet charm. But the scene inside her apartment told a story no one could have imagined. She had been decapitated. Her head was placed deliberately on a bookshelf facing the bed, eyes wide open, lips frozen in a grimace of final terror. Her body lay face down on the floor, arms stretched outward as if still reaching for someone, anyone to save her. There was no sign of struggle, no scream, just the silent imprint of a calculated execution. The apartment, once again, was disturbingly clean. Blood had been used to paint a strange pattern on the floor. A spotless knife lay beside the front door, as if the killer had performed a ritual and exited with absolute calm. 3 victims in 48 hours, each murdered brutally, each body positioned in a way that seemed to speak. The message was clear now. This wasn't random. It was the work of a methodical killer, repeating a dark personal script with terrifying precision. News spread like wildfire. Local stations ran constant updates. National networks began flying reporters into Gainesville. Across the country, panic rippled as America realized a serial killer was targeting students in what was once considered a quiet college town. Panic took hold. Gun shops overflowed with desperate customers. Lines stretched out into the streets as people waited to buy whatever protection they could get their hands on. Store owners limited purchases, 1 gun per person, but still the demand was overwhelming. Parents cried over phones, pleading with their children to come home. Some didn't wait. They drove across state lines to Gainesville to bring their sons and daughters back before it was too late. Fear seeped into every corner of the city. Dorms went on lockdown. Security patrols roamed the campus overnight. Students huddled together in small rooms, keeping lights on through the night. Sleep became a luxury, and checking the locks every hour became routine. Gainesville was no longer the city of youthful dreams. It had become a maze of fear, where anyone at any time could be next. And the worst part? There were still no clear clues, no suspects, no face to attach to the nightmare. Somewhere in the shadows, he was still watching, still waiting. And he wasn't finished. Just as investigators were beginning to piece together evidence from the previous scenes, another call shattered their fragile momentum. A strong odor had been reported coming from a second-floor apartment in a small complex on the west side of Gainesville. This time, the horror wasn't limited to a female victim. The door burst open under police force, and what lay beyond felt suffocating. On the floor was the lifeless body of a young male student. Manny. His body was battered, covered in wounds, blood sprayed across the walls. Unlike the other victims, Manny had fought back. There were scratch marks, bruises, and bloodied handprints everywhere. He had battled until his final breath. But he had lost. On the bed lay Tracy, Manny's girlfriend. Her body was still, wrapped in a blood-soaked sheet. She had been stabbed repeatedly, the mattress beneath her dark with dried blood. Her face was frozen in fear, as if the nightmare hadn't ended even in death. For the first time, a male victim had entered the picture, shattering every previous assumption investigators had drawn. This killer wasn't targeting women alone. He didn't choose based on gender. He chose timing, vulnerability, and control. These weren't crimes of passion, hate, or lust. They were part of something larger, a deliberate plan to instill ultimate fear. Outside their apartment, the silence was deafening. Police cordoned off the entire building. Neighbors watched from behind police tape, clutching their children, murmuring the same desperate questions. Why them? Why here? When will it stop? Once again, the crime scene had been eerily clean. No signs of forced entry, no missing valuables. The killer had taken his time, staged the bodies with the same grotesque care, and vanished into thin air. Law enforcement began to unravel. The patterns were breaking down. No longer could they rely on a victim profile. The locations, timing, and methods varied. The only constant was the brutality and the complete disappearance of the predator after each kill. In just 3 days, Gainesville had gone from a lively college town to a steel trap of fear. The once bright faces of students who had arrived with hope were now bowed in the quiet, locked corridors of dormitories. Darkness didn't just fall on the streets, it crept into minds. People distrusted their neighbors. They feared their friends. Everyone wondered if they might be the next name on the morning news. And while the city shook in search for answers, somewhere in the shadows, the killer watched. Waiting. Amid the chaos of panic and fear spreading across Gainesville, investigators began quietly piecing together the fragments from 4 horrifying crime scenes. And as they started to connect even the smallest details, a chilling picture began to emerge. This wasn't just a killer. It was someone who knew the human body, someone who understood death, someone who had studied how to take life quickly and cleanly. Each cut on the victims was disturbingly precise, right at the joints targeting major arteries. There were no extra slashes, no signs of panic. These weren't wild stabbings. They were surgical, intentional, controlled. It didn't take long for medical examiners to agree. This was the work of someone with deep knowledge of anatomy, possibly even with forensic or medical training. The wounds all followed a pattern, same direction, same depth, same methodical order. The killer acted with the precision of someone who had either studied human anatomy or had experience in military or forensic fields. The blades didn't shake. The hand that held them didn't tremble. The murder weapon, identified at multiple scenes, was a Ka-bar combat knife, a military-grade tool often used by U.S. Marines. It wasn't a kitchen knife grabbed in rage. It was a weapon meant for killing, for maximum damage, and for instilling terror. This wasn't about chance. It was about domination. Then came the DNA. Small samples, almost invisible to the eye, began to surface. A smear on a doorframe, a hair caught in a lampshade, a flake of skin beneath a fingernail. The forensic team got to work, and when the first DNA profile was returned, every eye in the investigation room turned toward it. It didn't match any known offender in Florida's database. The man they were hunting had never been arrested, never flagged. But the same DNA appeared at every scene. Sonia and Christina, Krista, Tracy. It was him. One man. One ghost leaving behind a signature in blood. The lead investigator stared at the results. No name, no face, no background. Just a ghost who moved through the city like smoke and left behind chaos like fire. He had no interest in hiding the bodies. On the contrary, he displayed them. And he did so with the precision and flair of an artist. Each crime scene, upon closer analysis, revealed shocking patterns. Victim placement, blade angles, the use of shadows and light. In one scene, the body was positioned directly in front of the door, so the first person who entered would be forced to look death in the eye. In another, the killer had adjusted the lighting to shine directly on the blood splatter, casting a symmetrical, haunting glow on the wall. This wasn't murder, it was theater. Every detail intentional, every scene designed. The victims were props, the rooms were his canvases, and the blood was his paint. He didn't kill for rage or revenge, he killed for effect, for symbolism, for control. What scared the profilers most wasn't just his intelligence, it was how calculated his cruelty had become. He wasn't trying to get away with it. He was trying to be seen, to be feared. He left just enough evidence to torment the investigators, but never enough to be caught. And now they knew the truth. They weren't just chasing a killer. They were chasing a man who understood the rules of investigation, of evidence, of psychology, and was using all of it against them, through blood, art, and primal terror. As the case became a national sensation, Gainesville no longer resembled a typical college town. It had turned into a battleground, silent but relentless, between fear and the pursuit of justice. While panic consumed the city, investigators worked tirelessly behind the scenes, connecting every fragment, chasing every shadow. Over 18,000 pieces of evidence were collected from the 5 brutal crime scenes, an overwhelming number for any investigation. Strands of hair, specks of blood, fibers from clothing, muddy footprints, and smudged fingerprints on glass, all carefully bagged, tagged, and sent for testing. The crime lab operated around the clock. The lights never went out. Digital records were pulled. ATM withdrawals, traffic camera footage, hospital files, and student housing logs, all were fed into an expanding database. Analysts, forensic scientists, even criminal profilers from out of state joined the effort. Gainesville was in the grip of a methodical manhunt. Eventually, a list of 675 potential suspects was compiled, each flagged for behavior, background, or circumstantial evidence. One name slowly rose to the top: Ed Humphrey, 19 years old, a former University of Florida student. His face bore scars from a past accident, his eyes distant, disconnected, his behavior erratic and unsettling. He talked to himself, suffered from deep depression, and had been reported multiple times for threatening behavior. Ed had a history of mental illness and had undergone mandatory psychiatric treatment. To the public, he fit the profile too well. And Gainesville took notice. News outlets swarmed the story. Local headlines screamed, "Suspect identified in Gainesville murders?" National channels aired grainy photos of Ed, zoomed in on his expression under the harsh light of arrest. Analysts dissected his life, his mental health history, his childhood trauma, turning him into the monster people needed to see. The city, worn thin by fear, latched onto him. It didn't matter if he had been charged or not. He looked guilty. He acted strange. And that was enough. Police brought Ed in for questioning. He didn't resist. If anything, he seemed detached, muttering incoherently and occasionally laughing at nothing. His behavior fueled the narrative. Every nonsensical answer, every blank stare became further evidence in the court of public opinion. Gainesville exhaled, classes resumed. Some students returned to campus. News anchors praised law enforcement. The public celebrated what they believed was the end of the nightmare. But behind the scenes, the truth painted a different picture. In the crime lab, Ed's DNA was run through again and again, against samples from each murder scene. The result never changed. No match. Not even a trace of him at the scenes. No fibers. No fingerprints. Nothing. And yet no one wanted to hear that. Not the public. Not the press. They had found their villain. They didn't know the real monster was still out there, watching from the dark and smiling. Ed Humphrey remained behind bars, held on unrelated charges, yet to the public it felt like justice had been served. The media eased up. The headlines faded. Gainesville slowly slipped back into routine. Cafes reopened late into the night. Students trickled back into lecture halls and dorms. People exhaled, comforted by the illusion that the monster had been locked away. But behind the calm, a colder truth lingered. Physical evidence, the one thing that doesn't lie, continued to deny Ed's involvement. His DNA didn't match a single sample from the crime scenes. No fingerprints, no blood, no hair. The forensic team ran triple checks. Still nothing. Someone else had committed those murders. And that someone was still free, moving unseen through the city, perhaps even watching the headlines with quiet amusement. The investigation stalled. Leads dried up. Task force meetings grew shorter. Investigators began to look weary, their eyes dimming with quiet frustration. Gainesville may have looked peaceful again, but it was the kind of peace that comes from denial, not resolution. Deep down, everyone knew the beast was still out there. Then in mid-October, something shifted. A forensic technician reviewing federal crime reports stumbled upon a file from Louisiana, one that had never been connected to the Gainesville killings. It was from nearly a year earlier in the city of Shreveport. The victims, a family of 3, a father, mother, and their 8-year-old son, all murdered inside their home. Their bodies had been posed in unnatural positions, blood painted in arcs across the walls, and a Ka-bar military knife left by the sink. At the time, the case had been treated as a home invasion gone wrong. No suspects, no arrests. The file had quietly been archived in the national system. But now, comparing it to Gainesville, the similarities were too precise to ignore. The victim staging, the weapon, the ritualistic feel, the stab patterns, even the placement of the bodies, nearly identical. The technician reported it immediately. A joint task force was formed between Florida and Louisiana. Investigators revisited the old crime scene in Shreveport, re-examining photographs, revisiting evidence, re-interviewing witnesses, and combing through archived traffic footage. And then buried deep in the Louisiana evidence logs, they found it. A previously unlinked DNA sample, collected from the scene but never matched to anyone, was run against the DNA found in Gainesville. This time the match came instantly. It was the same man. Gainesville and Shreveport, two cities nearly 600 miles apart, two massacres separated by nearly a year, both carried out by the same hands. This wasn't impulsive rage, this wasn't random madness. This was a traveling predator. A ghost on the move, slipping between states, taking lives with surgical precision, and vanishing without a trace. He left behind horror, death, and a fear so profound it had no face. For the first time in weeks, the investigators faced a terrifying clarity. They weren't chasing a single case in Gainesville anymore. They were hunting a serial killer with a pattern, a purpose, and a chilling ability to disappear. A drifter who killed with method and hid like he never existed at all. When the true killer was still a phantom beyond the reach of the law, the investigation began expanding beyond Gainesville. Every temporary housing record, every petty crime committed during the time frame of the murders was meticulously reviewed. And then a quiet name surfaced in an arrest file for armed robbery in Gainesville: Danny Harold Rowling. Rowling had no permanent address. He was a true drifter, constantly moving between states. At the time of his arrest, Rowling had been hiding out in an old beat-up van, living on the outskirts of the city. He was caught after robbing a small convenience store. No resistance, no noise. But when investigators reopened his file, something didn't sit right. He had previously lived in Shreveport, Louisiana, at the exact time a family of 3 was massacred. Shortly after, he abruptly left the city. And not long after that, the Gainesville murders began. The lead was fragile, but it was enough to act on. A tracking unit was dispatched to search the dense woods where Rowling had camped for weeks before his arrest. It was a desolate patch of forest just over 10 kilometers from Gainesville, a place few dared to enter after dark. Overgrown, blanketed in dry leaves, the forest held a silence that seemed to conceal something sinister. In a camouflaged corner of his campsite, hidden beneath branches and rotting foliage, they found everything. A dark fabric hood, crudely stitched but tailored to fit a human face. Rolls of duct tape. A Ka-bar military-style knife wrapped carefully in oilcloth. Tattered clothing with unmistakable dried bloodstains on the pant leg, later confirmed by lab tests to be the blood of Manny, the only male victim in the murder spree. There was more. A plastic bag containing cassette tapes, audio recordings. The voice was deep, dry, unsettling. He repeated chilling phrases like, "I am the darkness, they will know my name, and blood is my witness." A handwritten journal was also discovered, filled with passages describing a twisted euphoria after releasing the pain of young souls. The entire investigative team stood frozen. There was no longer any doubt. Danny Rowling wasn't just a petty thief. He was the embodiment of the darkness Gainesville had feared for weeks. From an overlooked inmate in a crowded jail, Rowling instantly became the central figure in a capital murder investigation. Yet he remained silent. Cold. He didn't confess. He didn't deny. His eyes stared blankly through the bars, deep, hollow, as if everything had gone exactly as he intended. Now the investigation had a face, a name, and a trail. Danny Harold Rowling, homeless, rootless, but behind him, a trail of blood-soaked nightmares. And he felt no remorse. The evidence wasn't left by accident. He wanted it to be found. Too late, but unmistakably, Gainesville had finally seen the true face of the monster in the dark. Inside the forensic lab at the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, a single DNA sample was fed into the system. Everyone in the room held their breath. When the result appeared, no one spoke. They simply exchanged glances, solemn, heavy. The message on the screen confirmed what investigators had suspected all along. Danny Harold Rowling was the man who murdered Sonia, Christina, Krista, Manny, and Tracy. Every DNA sample from the crime scenes matched him perfectly. DNA doesn't lie. It doesn't bend to public pressure, emotion, or media noise. It exists to answer one question, yes or no. And this time, the answer was indisputable. Gainesville had its killer. Not Ed Humphrey, not some shadowy figure lost in theory. It was Danny Rowling, unequivocally. But in a case of this magnitude, with the death penalty on the table, scientific truth alone wasn't enough. By law, and especially in a case that had gripped the nation, prosecutors needed more than evidence. They needed complete assurance that the jury would be unanimous. And nothing persuades a jury more than a confession from the killer himself. But Rowling wasn't going to give it up easily. He sat behind bars, cold and detached. Every question was met with silence, vague mutterings, or unsettling bursts of laughter. He knew they were waiting for him to speak, and he enjoyed it. He wasn't afraid. He was in control. The prosecution team understood the risk. Entering trial without a confession, even with strong forensic proof, meant leaving a sliver of doubt for the defense to exploit. They needed the door shut completely. They needed the killer to say it out loud. So they changed tactics. Instead of hard questioning, the prosecution sent in someone different, a criminal psychologist, someone who had spent years talking to serial killers. He didn't bring files. He didn't ask direct questions. They spoke like two lonely men in a quiet world. No pressure, no police, just conversation. And in that quiet, something in Rowling began to crack. He started to talk. At first it was small. Childhood memories, stories of his abusive father, nights spent curled up alone in the woods. Then he spoke of the darkness in his mind, of voices that told him to kill. Eventually, he said names. One day he whispered, "Christina, she begged me, but I couldn't stop." The next of Manny. He fought harder than I expected, but it ended all the same. Each word drove the truth deeper. The recordings captured every phrase. The admissions were fragmented, but unmistakable. There was no more doubt. Then came the specifics, things only the killer could know. The knife placed under the stove, the pattern of blood on the curtains, the way Tracy's eyes stayed open. With every eerie detail, the prosecution team knew they had the key. This wasn't a man confessing out of guilt. This was a man reliving victory. Now they had everything. DNA evidence, physical proof from the campsite, handwritten journals, audio recordings, and, most crucially, a confession, spoken piece by piece by the killer himself. Every puzzle piece had snapped into place. There were no holes left, no ambiguity, no defense strong enough to stand. Danny Harold Rowling, the drifter, the shadow, the architect of Gainesville's terror, was finally facing the verdict he had written in blood, silence, and the haunting grin he wore while watching the world tremble. In the early days of his incarceration, Danny Rowling didn't act like a serial killer. He was calm, oddly polite, often muttering Bible verses under his breath, clutching a worn Bible as if clinging to some last thread of faith. He asked to pray before meals. He bowed his head to the guards. He painted the picture of a man seeking redemption. He wanted the world to see something else, a repentant soul, a broken man trying to find his way back to the light. To the untrained eye, it was a convincing act. But Rod Smith wasn't fooled. Prosecutor Rod Smith, a seasoned investigator and trial strategist, had seen this game before. He knew how manipulators worked, how they used religion as a shield and silence as power. So Smith didn't confront Rowling head-on. He waited. He listened. He dropped questions like pebbles in still water, and the ripples began to show. Under gentle pressure, in casual conversations stripped of threat or accusation, Rowling began to shed his saintly mask. What began as vague talk of forgiveness and redemption soon shifted to subtle deflections. He stopped saying, "I regret," and started saying, "I was led, and I wasn't in control." And then he named it. "Not me. It was him. Gemini," Rowling whispered, as if revealing the deepest secret of his soul. According to him, Gemini wasn't just a name. It was a presence, a voice in the dark, an entity that lived within him. It had first come to him in the cold, in the loneliest nights, when he had nothing and no one. Gemini was the one who told him to kill, who laughed when blood spilled, who whispered that each murder was a necessary ritual. Smith didn't challenge him. He simply nodded and asked gently, "And when Gemini killed, did you see it happen?" Rowling's lips tightened, a pause, then a nod. "Yes, I saw it, but I didn't do it. It was him, it was Gemini." For the first time, Rowling placed himself at the scenes. Even if cloaked in the language of split personalities, it was a confession. The law doesn't recognize demons. It recognizes actions and the man who carried them out. Smith kept going. He didn't dismiss Gemini. He didn't affirm him either. He just listened, as if trying to understand a tormented soul. And for the first time, Rowling opened up, not out of guilt, but because he felt understood. Seen. He spoke more. About his lonely childhood. About his abusive father. About drifting from state to state with no home, no purpose. Somewhere in that darkness, he had created Gemini. Not as a defense, but as a twisted kind of salvation. A way to separate himself from the monster he had become. Gemini told me if I did it, I'd be seen, he said, tears catching in his eyes. Smith knew it wasn't remorse, it was survival. Rowling's last instinct trying to explain away the carnage. But that made his words all the more valuable. Every sentence, every image he described became another building block in the case against him. Danny Rowling wanted to blame a demon, but everyone knew it was his hands that held the knife. Not some shadow, not Gemini. It was Danny. His cold stare, his bloodied grip, his hollow soul. The act of a pious man had crumbled. What remained was the raw, unfiltered truth of a manipulative, dangerous killer who had never truly repented. And that truth, spoken in his own words, was the most terrifying confession of all. Behind the mask of faux holiness, Danny Rowling began to reveal his true self through the one thing he enjoyed most, boasting about his crimes. Inside his dim jail cell, surrounded by cold concrete and steel, Rowling wasn't silent out of fear. He was silent because he was savoring control. It was the one thing he had always craved. Soon he found a kindred spirit behind bars. Bobby Lewis, a fellow death row inmate with a reputation of his own. Lewis wasn't just any prisoner. He had been at the center of brutal murders himself and understood the twisted language of darkness. Rowling chose him as his messenger, the one to deliver the truths he wouldn't say directly to the law. Through whispered exchanges in confinement, Danny began sending out messages, not spoken, but written. He penned letters, crude handwriting on yellowed pages, but every word bled with intent. He didn't plead for mercy. He didn't deny the killings. Instead, he recounted them in chilling detail. He described stalking his victims from afar, slipping into their homes under the cover of night, gliding like a phantom past curtains and furniture. He detailed the sensation of the blade-piercing flesh, the coldness of steel, the gas as life was drained. Beyond the violence, he described the spiritual clarity he felt in those moments, a twisted euphoria, warped beyond recognition. In one letter, he wrote, "When the blood flows, I am no longer me, I am Gemini, and Gemini only exists when I do this." Bobby Lewis passed these letters on to investigator Rod Smith, each word becoming damning evidence. These weren't just confessions. They were self-portraits of a fractured psyche, delusional, depraved, but fully aware. Rowling understood his actions were evil. He simply believed he had a purpose in them. He wrote of standing in front of a mirror after each murder, staring into his own eyes and smiling. He called it the purest moment of his life. Then he would return to his campsite, write in his journal, and listen to tapes of himself reciting poetry, as if every kill was just another act in an elaborate performance. Investigators read the letters with a mix of horror and disbelief. The descriptions weren't just evidence. They were windows into a mind warped beyond redemption. The most terrifying part was that Rowling expressed no remorse. He didn't write, "I wish I had stopped." He wrote, "I wish I had more time." Each sentence, each paragraph was a slap in the face to the idea that he was simply a product of trauma or mental illness. No, Danny Rowling was fully conscious. He knew exactly who he was, and he took pride in it. These letters, along with the confessions, audio tapes, and journals, formed one of the most complete psychological profiles of a killer with two faces, one who committed murder and one who reveled in it. And for the first time, there was no need for Gemini as an excuse. Danny, by his own hand, had written his death sentence, not with a knife, but with every word. As the official trial date was announced, the media swarmed Gainesville like bees to a hive. Major outlets from New York, Chicago, even international reporters, flooded the city. Locals lined up outside the courthouse, eager to witness history unfold, the trial of the monster who had haunted their town. But the trial did not go as expected. There were no lengthy arguments, no dramatic courtroom duels between prosecution and defense, no tearful witness testimonies. Danny Harold Rowling entered the courtroom with a face devoid of emotion, his eyes calm and eerily composed. No regret, no fear. Then, in a move that silenced the entire room, he stood up and confessed. He didn't just confess to the 5 murders in Gainesville. He took full responsibility for the triple homicide in Shreveport, Louisiana, the long, cold case that had eluded authorities for nearly a year. He confirmed each victim's name, each wound, each brutal detail, as though reciting a well-memorized script. There was no defense, no plea for mercy. He handed himself over, not out of remorse, but because he wanted to control the final act. Rod Smith, the prosecutor who had pursued Rowling across months of relentless investigation, nodded in silence. He understood that this moment, when the killer claimed his crimes aloud, marked the true end of the chase. At the back of the courtroom, some wiped away tears, not out of sorrow but because justice had finally spoken. When the jury convened to deliver their verdict, there was no hesitation. The evidence was overwhelming. The confessions were clear. The letters, the journals, the tapes, and now, this open admission, all pointed to a single, inevitable outcome. Danny Harold Rowling was sentenced to death. The sentence was read slowly, each word deliberate and final, echoing through the hushed courtroom. And through it all, Danny sat still, smiling faintly. It wasn't a smile of regret. It was the smile of a man who had completed his performance. From the killings, to the escape, to the confession, he had choreographed every step, and now he savored his last moment of control. But Gainesville no longer feared him. That day, the townspeople walked out of the courthouse into the bright Florida sun, their shoulders lighter. The shadow that once loomed over their city now had a name, a face, and was finally caged by justice. There was no doubt left, no fear, only memories to heal, and a renewed belief that no matter how close the darkness comes, the light will always find its way. For the people of Gainesville, the trial's conclusion marked the beginning of healing. But for those who had worked the case, those who had walked the crime scenes, examined the horror, stared into the void left by the murders, the wounds remained, etched not in reports, but in memory. Rod Smith, the lead prosecutor who guided the entire case, never forgot the look in Danny Rowling's eyes in that courtroom, a gaze void of fear, devoid of remorse, soaking in the chaos he had caused. Smith had tried many killers before, but none as cold as this. To him, Rowling wasn't just a murderer. He was a mirror reflecting the purest form of human darkness. For the investigators, those first on the scene, images of the mutilated bodies staged like grotesque displays would never fade. Some of them sought therapy afterward. Others transferred out of homicide altogether, unwilling to face another case so cruel. One investigator, when asked years later, simply said, "I'll never forget the way he left her body, like he was trying to say something to the world using flesh and blood." Gainesville, too, was forever changed. Dormitories that once echoed with laughter now locked their doors by 10 p.m. Parents no longer sent their children to university with the same peace of mind. The city, once known for its warmth and safety, lived under a quiet, lingering caution. Dimly lit parking lots and forest trails, once ignored, became places to avoid. But more than anyone, it was the families of the victims who bore the deepest scars. They didn't seek the spotlight. They didn't speak to the press. They didn't chase headlines. They just continued to live, not to forget, but to carry on with their pain. At a memorial service, Sonia's father once said, "I don't want to hear his name. I just want my daughter to rest in peace." Manny's family left his room exactly as it was. The desk, the books, the letters home describing campus life. His mother never touched the chair he sat in to write those letters. For them, justice wasn't about revenge. It was about acknowledgement that their son had been taken by someone unworthy of remembrance. Even with Danny Rowling sentenced to death, the wounds he left behind could not be stitched up with a verdict. All the families wanted was one thing, that no one else should ever feel the pain they had lived through. And that Gainesville never forget, safety isn't something granted. It is something earned, protected through vigilance, awareness, and the unwavering light of justice. When the world believed that all of Danny Rowling's victims were dead, a shocking truth emerged. There was one who had survived, a woman who had looked directly into the face of evil and lived to tell the tale. Her name was Janet Frank. Janet wasn't a student. She was a young woman living a few miles outside Gainesville, working night shifts at a small gas station on the edge of a rural highway. On an early August night, as she cleaned up to close the shop, she felt eyes watching her from the empty parking lot. Before she could scream or reach for the phone, a dark figure lunged, slamming her onto the cold tile floor. It was Danny Rowling. He wore no mask. He made no effort to hide his face. He believed there would be no witnesses left alive. But Janet wasn't like his other victims. She fought back, scratching, kicking, anything to buy herself seconds. Her hand found the only object nearby, a fruit knife beside the cash register. Without hesitation, she stabbed upward, striking his shoulder. He screamed, then fled into the night, leaving behind a trail of blood and a handprint smeared across the wooden counter. When police arrived, Janet was shaking but conscious. She gave a detailed description of his face, his build, even his breathing, down to the scent of his body. Most importantly, she hadn't wiped the counter. She hadn't touched the knife. The evidence remained. That blood sample would later be tested and match perfectly with Danny Rowling's DNA. Janet's account, sharp, vivid, and unwavering, bolstered the already overwhelming case against him. She didn't just survive, she helped identify the killer. But surviving didn't mean healing. Janet never returned to that gas station. She moved, changed her phone number, and declined every interview. For her, life after the attack was a quiet war between guilt for surviving and the trauma of having been prey. Still, she stood as undeniable proof of one thing. Danny Rowling was not invincible. He could bleed. He could fail. And her survival, her testimony, shattered the myth he'd built around himself. During the trial, Janet did not appear in court, but her testimony, forensic reports, and the physical evidence from that night were presented to the jury as irrefutable proof. Danny Rowling was not some supernatural force. He was a man, cruel, dangerous, and ultimately defeated by the courage of a young woman in the dark. Danny Rowling was placed on death row at Florida State Prison, a facility reserved for the state's most dangerous and unforgivable criminals. In the years that followed his sentencing, he waited for execution in silence. The arrogance was gone. The haunting speeches had stopped. Time stretched endlessly, fitting for a man who once stole so many lives. But now he controlled nothing. Gainesville, once a city filled with laughter and the bright energy of new school years, had weathered a season of blood and fear. For a time, the name Gainesville was whispered with dread, tied to loss, suspicion, and unspeakable horror. But through the determination of investigators, the relentless pursuit of justice, and above all, the courage of those who survived, the shadow was finally broken. Danny Rowling, the monster who thrived in darkness, was unmasked. He was no longer Gemini, no longer the one in control. He was just another condemned man, awaiting his end in a cold cell. On the day of his execution, there were no tears, no farewells, only quiet exhalations from those who had once lived in terror. The families of the victims didn't cheer, but they no longer crumbled. They understood. Justice had run its course. And Gainesville, after everything, could finally sleep again. The past wasn't erased, it wasn't forgotten. But now it no longer chained the city. It lived as memory, as proof that evil can rise and be defeated. The ghost was dead, and the town lived on.